I want to talk to you about the impact of the global financial crisis on Asia. I think one of the most interesting aspects of the crisis is the contrast between what's happening to China and what's happening to Japan. This will not just affect the two economies, but also the two countries' roles in the world. First, let me look at China. China headed into this global crisis at a moment of domestic transition. In 2007, 2008, the Chinese economy had an unusual problem. Inflation was rising very fast. It had gone from roughly 0 to over 8% in about 2 years. At the same time, there was a wave of bankruptcies, especially along the coast. So it was hard to know what the authorities should do. Should they raise interest rates to deal with the inflation, or should they cut them to deal with the bankruptcies? This kind of situation occurs when an economy is at a moment of structural transformation. China has had extraordinary success with an economic model that had two components that were coming to the end of their usefulness. One component was a capital-intensive, heavy industry-driven growth in petrochemicals, in steel, in aluminum, in concrete, in infrastructure. These industries had built the backbone of China's modern economy, but they were getting less useful. They were using up so many resources, driving up oil prices, aluminum prices, copper prices all over the world. They were very capital intensive. They were state intensive. And their contribution to factor productivity was declining. When you built the road from Beijing to Shanghai, that had a huge benefit to economic growth. When a lot of the funding was going into things like village shopping centers, it wasn't making such a great contribution to growth. The second component was very low-level, very labor-intensive industries, making shoes and socks and toys with very cheap labor. And with wages rising, a skilled labor shortage, that component was also coming to an end. So it was a time when China needed to move to a new phase of economic success based on small and medium enterprises, on private enterprise, on more service enterprises. And the transition was happening a little bit more slowly than ideal. So it really got underway just before the global financial crisis hit. You had a rising currency, which helped the transformation. You had new labor laws, which helped the transformation. You had higher interest rates, which helped get the inflation down. And you had rising wages because of a skilled labor shortage. And all of these hit the low-level export-oriented industry very hard. And just at that time, the global financial crisis caused a collapse of demand. We might call this a perfect storm. Hit the Chinese economy very hard. And now, how does that compare with what's happened in Japan? And while everything I've said up till now emphasizes how hard the Chinese economy was hit, the contrast with Japan shows how much better positioned China was than Japan has been. To start with, the Japanese economy really only grows because of export growth. China, on the other hand, contrary to conventional wisdom, has very diverse, mainly domestic drivers of economic growth. In 2007, the economy grew 13%. Of that growth, 3.3% came from net export growth, 9.7% came from domestic growth. So compared with Japan, China is in a much better situation there. Second, China's economy adjusts much faster than Japan's because the Chinese economy, on almost any measure, is something like 3 times as open as the Japanese economy. That means it's more competitive. It adjusts to a new situation much faster. Japan's export markets are confined to a few sectors, mainly cars, consumer electronics, video games, a few things like that. China's exports are very diversified. When you look at where these economies can grow in the future, it's obvious where China can move upmarket. It can move to higher technology, to more complex manufacturing in many, many areas. It's much more difficult to see exactly what the Japanese economy is going to grow into, because historically it hasn't been as innovative as the United States in creating whole new areas for a very rich economy to grow into. If you look at the room for government policy to change, Chinese interest rates had plenty of room to adjust down. They started at about 4.5%, but Japanese interest rates have been varying between 0.5% and 0.1%, so not much room there. On the fiscal side, China's in a very comfortable fiscal position with very limited domestic debt. Japan, on the other hand, is estimated by the IMF to be headed toward national debt that's 224% of its economy by the end of next year. That's far higher than any other successful economy. So the Chinese government has lots of policy room. The Japanese government has very little policy room. Chinese banks are coming off of a huge reform and are very well capitalized, in a position to expand their lending very quickly. Japanese banks were reformed and recapitalized, but they reverted back to having a lot of their capital tied up in the stock market. And as the stock market went down, the Japanese banks were squeezed for capital and are not able to do the kind of generous lending that the Chinese banks are able to do. Finally, the Chinese authorities were very decisive. and are very reformist in their approach to managing the economy, whereas the Japanese authorities have been very indecisive. The ruling party has been basically uninterested in further economic reform. The opposition party is even more vehemently opposed to reform. So the Japanese economy is in a very difficult, poorly managed situation compared with China's. Now, all of this has tremendous geopolitical consequences. China's role in the region has been rising very fast, and Japan's has been declining. And what this differential response to the global crisis means is that process is going to be greatly accelerated. Already the U.S. Found in the last few years that when there's a problem in Asia that it needs to solve, China becomes the necessary partner. In dealing with North Korea, China has been the key partner in the war on terror, in regional crime, regional drugs. China has been the principal partner in promoting freedom of trade and freedom of investment and genetically modified crops that are very important to the United States. China is way ahead of Japan in moving in those directions that the United States sees as being in its interest. So we're headed into a world where China's role is going to rise much faster, and Japan's is going to decline much more quickly as a result of different responses to the global crisis.